In a life defined by a fatal illness, the only world that mattered was the one on his screen. He poured his final days into the game, mastering its every facet. But death was not the end. He awoke in that same world, stripped of every achievement, every power. Now a novice in the land he once dominated, he faces a brutal new reality. To survive, he must not just play the game, he must conquer it. The story begins with Takuto, a young man confined to a hospital bed, whose only escape is an empire management strategy game called Eternal Nations. His dedication to the game is so profound that he literally dies while playing. However, death is not the end for him. Moments later, he awakens in a lush forest, seated upon a throne in what appears to be ancient ruins. The first thing he notices is the crisp, fresh air, a stark contrast to the sterile hospital environment. A beautiful woman with elven features approaches, asking if he is finally awake. Takuto instantly recognizes her as Atu, a character from his beloved game. To his bewilderment, Atu addresses him as Your Majesty, leaving him utterly confused. As a seasoned anime viewer, Takuto quickly deduces he has been transported into the world of Eternal Nations. Atu reveals that he is the first player ever to conquer the game's nightmare difficulty level using Mynoghra, the most challenging civilization. This achievement, she explains, has earned him a legendary status on the leaderboards. Takuto's confusion deepens. How could a game character possess such meta-knowledge? Atu clarifies that she remembers everything, every victory, every defeat, and every word he ever spoke to her through his computer screen. Tears well up in Takuto's eyes as he learns that his connection with his favorite character was not one-sided. He expresses his joy at finally being able to converse with her directly, and Atu reciprocates the sentiment. When he asks if she was the one who brought him here, she confesses her own ignorance, having found herself in this mysterious world only moments before him. Holding his hands, Atu encourages Takuto to start anew and build another empire, one where they can live together. With no other purpose, he agrees to share her ambition. As they shake on it, Atu playfully reverts to her in-game persona, introducing herself as Atu the Sludge, an illegitimate child of the ruined world, and vows her eternal loyalty. Though the evil character trope feels cliché and leaves them both slightly embarrassed, Takuto joins in the roleplay. He declares that with Atu as his right hand, he will establish the most infamous empire the world has ever known, Mynoghra. Their first order of business, as any good Mynoghra ruler would know, is to remain hidden. To this end, Takuto summons an emergency production scout, a grotesque, long-legged bug befitting the evil and ruinous nature of his civilization. He commands the scout to survey their surroundings, a task Atu emphasizes it must not fail. Through a shared vision with the scout, Takuto realizes that the mechanics of this new world mirror those of the game. He explains to Atu that summoning the scout cost him 100 of his 200 magic power. He contemplates using the remaining MP to establish a base or summon a warrior, though the latter is currently beyond his means. Atu, a hero unit, is strong in combat, but her power level is a mere 3 at this early stage. The scout's reconnaissance reveals an endless expanse of trees, an ideal location for their hidden base. However, Atu notes the unsettling absence of wildlife for food. As it's too risky to move, Takuto sends the scout to survey a wider area. Feeling useless, Atu is comforted by Takuto, who assures her that her presence alone is more than enough. Touched by his words, she finds herself falling for him. The scout soon discovers a camp of dark elves. Wary of trespassing and inviting conflict, Takuto resolves to observe them from a distance. But their plans are abruptly thwarted when 3 dark elves stumble upon their location, leaving them in a precarious situation. The dark elves, led by Captain Gia, are not hostile. They have been exiled from their city and have led their people deep into this cursed forest for safety. Their journey has left them without food, and their children are starving. Gia, burdened by the weight of his people's survival, had been wandering the forest in a desperate search for sustenance. Sensing Takuto and Atu's presence, Gia panics, fearing an attack. He knows that the fate of his race rests on his next move. Upon seeing the enigmatic, black-clad Takuto and the elven Atu, Gia and his soldiers immediately drop to their knees, admitting their trespass. Atu sternly questions their presence in the Forbidden Land. Gia recounts their tragic tale of banishment and starvation, his anxiety palpable under Atu's cold gaze. To his astonishment, Takuto simply asks if he is hungry. After a moment of hesitation, Gia affirms that he is. In response, Takuto materializes several apples. Gia, having never seen such a fruit, is initially bewildered. As his soldiers begin to eat, Takuto produces pears as well. The Dark Elves have always faced hostility, and this act of unprompted kindness leaves Gia suspicious. He declares his intention to take the food back to the children, but before he can finish, Takuto summons even more fruit. The children in the Dark Elf camp are on the verge of death when Gia and his team return with a bounty of food, bringing with them a renewed sense of hope. As the camp feasts, Gia reflects on the mysterious figure he encountered. Later, an elder named Molter questions Gia about the origin of the strange, delicious fruit. Gia explains that he met a legend in the forest. Molter wonders if this could be the mythical king of ruins, a figure from ancient tales said to bring destruction. He presses Gia, asking what he offered in return for the food, convinced that no dark being would give something for nothing. Gia insists it was an act of pure benevolence from the Great One. Their debate concludes with Molter vowing to handle any future negotiations with their mysterious benefactor. Meanwhile, Atu is furious with Takuto for squandering his precious mana on strangers. She reminds him of the uncertain future and the battles they may face. He admits he acted out of pity and confesses his shyness around the Dark Elves, which Atu had mistaken for regal role-playing. Their playful bickering is interrupted by the return of the scout, its survey complete, leaving them to ponder their next move in this strange new world. And that's the end of the first episode of Apocalypse Bringer Mynoghra. The story continues. Molter cautiously asked Gia if he was truly ready to face the king again. He reasoned that the king had already extended them a significant act of charity, and there was no telling what he might demand in return later. Gia, however, remained doubtful, pointing out that the king had mentioned no such conditions. Molter insisted that, one way or another, a price would eventually be exacted, as that was simply the nature of the world. Despite these concerns, Molter was also aware that they needed to continue capitalizing on the king's kindness while they could. He argued that if they were to leave the forest, they would return to a life of wandering, where the struggle for food would become a constant battle once more. Molter then reminded him of their original purpose for coming to the Dark Continent, to establish a kingdom free from persecution. He stressed that this might be their last chance and expressed his hope for Gia's success, as the future of their entire people rested on it. Unbeknownst to them, the protagonist had overheard their entire conversation. Soon after, the protagonist's understanding of the situation was confirmed when his insect scout brought him a full report. The Dark Elves were indeed heading his way. Atu speculated that they were likely coming to retrieve the rest of the food, which they had been unable to carry during their last visit. Takuto, however, was wary. He believed that integrating beings of a different culture and ideology could lead to future conflicts. He would have preferred they simply take the food and leave, but he worried that a communication barrier would prevent any meaningful negotiation. Atu confidently assured him that communication would not be a problem, as she could handle the negotiations on his behalf. When the surprised protagonist asked if she was serious, she affirmed her loyalty. As their king, all he needed to do was give the order, and she would obey. A short while later, the elves arrived. From their perspective, the king's domain was a dark and gloomy place. Molter stepped forward, identifying himself as the elder of the Dark Elves. Atu acknowledged their respect, but curtly prompted them to state their purpose. Molter began by thanking them for the food, but then requested to know the king's name. Atu's anger flared at the demand, but the protagonist gave her a subtle nod, permitting her to reveal his identity. She formally declared that he was Era Takuto, the Lord of the Apocalypse, ruler of Ruin, instructing them to address him as King Era or King Takuto henceforth. She then introduced herself, making it clear that her station was inferior to the king's, so they would not mistake her for an equal. Molter expressed his gratitude for the information and promised that his people would remember their names. This pleased the protagonist, and Atu told the elves to take the food before it spoiled. However, Molter was not finished. He wished to know how they could repay such kindness. Atu dismissed the notion, doubting they possessed anything that could possibly satisfy her king. A nervous hesitation from Molter made Atu suspicious, and she sharply asked if he was plotting something. He quickly assured her that he was not. The protagonist saw an opportunity and suggested to Atu that they should establish clear terms, but she disliked the idea, believing the elves incapable of proper negotiation. When the protagonist insisted, Atu argued that it would be simpler to annihilate them now to prevent any future trouble. Takuto urged her to calm down, suggesting that the elves might also desire a mutually beneficial friendship. He proposed that instead of simply giving them the food, accepting something in return could put everyone at ease. Molter readily agreed, and the protagonist felt certain that this was the best path forward to ensure peace in the region. Atu, now following her king's lead, told the elves they were fools for ever thinking their king was some evil specter. Molter tried to clarify that he never thought such a thing, but Atu silenced him, struggling to conceive of a suitable price for the food. The protagonist suggested that they could share their knowledge of the outside world. Molter found this proposal perfect and offered to personally recount everything he had seen, heard, and experienced. Atu accepted the deal and added a final condition that left Gia trembling. Once the information was shared, they must leave the forest and never speak of what they had witnessed. The protagonist felt he understood the younger elf's desperation better than Molter did. Molter, however, made a final plea, requesting permission for his people to remain. Atu refused. Resigned, Molter told Gia that if it was the king's will, they had to obey. Molter gave his thanks and prepared to leave, but the protagonist wondered if he was doing the right thing, knowing that if the elves left the forest, they would likely die. At the last second, he called for them to wait and offered to make them his citizens, an act that shocked even Atu. She demanded to know what he was thinking. Takuto explained his plan to use the refugee system from his game. He knew the Dark Elves were neither inherently good nor evil, but if he accepted them as refugees into his civilization, the system would likely transform them to align with his and Atu's evil nature. Atu expressed her doubts, noting the vast differences between the elves and the homunculi, the primary citizens of their nation, Mynoghra. She predicted that conflict between the two groups was inevitable. Yet, the protagonist asked her to consider the unsettling appearance of the homunculi, and whether she could truly be content living only with citizens who couldn't even hold a conversation. Atu had to admit he had a point. With the decision made, Atu informed the elves that the king had chosen to found a civilization in this land. If they wished to become his citizens, the king would promise them his protection. Molter asked what would become of his tribe if they accepted. Atu explained that while the king would normally promise them eternal happiness, their reality would be a transformation into evil beings. She added, of course, that the choice was theirs, but she personally believed they would enjoy it more than they imagined. After a lengthy deliberation, a perfectly normal reaction, Takuto thought, to being told you're about to become evil, the elves accepted it. Soon, they arrived at the Dark Elf camp, where everyone bowed deeply in their presence. One even fainted from awe. Gia commanded his people not to look the king in the eyes out of respect. Once the king was seated on his throne, Atu officially declared them all citizens of Mynoghra. A prompt appeared before the protagonist to accept them as citizens, which he did without hesitation. Mynoghra had been founded. Gia initially felt no different, but then a strange and powerful feeling began to swell within him. A deep-seated hatred for those who had persecuted and looked down upon his people for so long. The other elves felt it too, but Gia quickly understood that this feeling was intertwined with the profound happiness of being cared for and protected. Overjoyed, the elves began to chant their new king's name in a display that strongly resembled a cult. Days later, a sobering reality set in. Upon examining a map, the protagonist was shocked to discover their terrible starting position. The continent was dominated by two large nations, the Holy Kingdom of Qualia, inhabited by humans who worshipped the god Arlos, and the Elemental Alliance, a nation of nature-worshipping elves. Both kingdoms were aligned with good, and if they discovered his fledgling nation, conflict would be unavoidable. This was especially dire as Mynoghra had no military strength, and the cursed lands they occupied were barren of natural resources. Yet, Takuto realized it wasn't all bad. Mynoghra had always struggled with research due to the homunculi's lack of intelligence. The addition of the clever dark elf, however, could drastically change their prospects. A short time later, Molter and Gia arrived with a young elf named Emily. Gia explained that Emily was exceptionally intelligent, possessing vast knowledge of stories and other nations, and would be of great help to the king's research. Atu thanked them for their cooperation and advised them to be less formal, as the king disliked it. She then assigned them to key administrative positions. Molter would oversee public affairs, where his magic was expected to be a great asset, and Gia would continue as warrior chief, leading Mynoghra's forces. Gia accepted with relish, vowing to commit all sorts of atrocities in the king's name, a declaration that deeply unsettled the conflict-averse protagonist. The poor elf couldn't comprehend why a king of ruin and evil would be such a pacifist. Atu instructed them to rest and regain their strength before beginning the construction of new houses. Molter promised his usefulness would far exceed Gia's brute force, sparking a brief argument between the two over who was better. Atu pointed out to the protagonist that they seemed eager to work. Takuto agreed it was best to prepare the land while their energy was high. When Atu asked Molter to gather wood without heavily impacting the forest, Gia was again confused by his king's desire for conservation. To his further bewilderment, the protagonist instructed them not to forget to reforest. The elves didn't understand, prompting Gia to ask what reforest even meant. Takuto found this fascinating, as it indicated the world's technological level was primarily focused on fortifications. The conversation shifted to magic. Atu asked if they knew of military magic and the 6 major elements. Molter replied that he only knew the 4 major elements, which formed the foundation of all magic. Emily had never heard of other nations using military magic. From this, the protagonist understood that this world was technologically behind his own knowledge. Molter asked if their magical technology was lower than the king expected, and Atu confirmed it was. However, she explained that this was an advantage, as it meant they could easily surpass other nations once they advanced. Returning to the topic of reforestation, she explained that it involved planting new trees in harvested land to conserve resources, a useful practice even in the real world. Emily pointed out that magical technology had little to do with planting trees, and Molter agreed, noting that trees take centuries to mature. This was when Atu revealed the secret. Reforestation in Mynoghra would use the major elements to accelerate tree growth, a piece of wisdom that came directly from the great king Takuto. Though the protagonist knew this wasn't true, Atu continued to build his legend, proclaiming the king's vast knowledge and wisdom, and telling the elves how fortunate they were to be his citizens. Emily then asked if the fruits they had been given were also created by the king. Atu confirmed they were, adding her particular fondness for the grapes. Emily mentioned that she had planted the seeds from the purple fruit and that they were already sprouting. The statement left both the protagonist and Atu speechless. Takuto had completely forgotten that the fruits he had given them were from the modern world. This implied he could spontaneously create things that didn't exist in the game. He tested the theory and successfully created a coin. With this newfound power, he realized everything would be much easier. He could manufacture gunpowder, base metals, and even oil. He was practically a genius inventor with cheat codes, the only limitation being the significant magical cost. The smile on his face said it all. Emily worriedly asked if she shouldn't have planted the seeds, but Atu quickly reassured her, congratulating her on the excellent work. Meanwhile, in a distant land, a blonde woman who appeared to be a saint spoke of apocalyptic omens originating from the accursed lands of the Dark Continent, a grave threat to both major nations. A cardinal arrived to inform her that barbarians had appeared in the northern province. A sense of urgency filled her. She knew she had to act, for something new and powerful was beginning to stir in the world. And that's the end of the 2nd episode of Apocalypse Bringer Mynoghra. Thank you so much for staying on this channel and watching our videos. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel so we can keep you updated with our latest content. See you in the next video.